Something has shifted in American leadership, in our institutions, in our politics, in our churches, and even in our personal lives. We talk a lot about leadership, but much less about service. What we are seeing in real time is the rise of what might be called self-servant leadership. Leadership that looks like service, but is fundamentally self-serving. It's leadership without humility, without shared purpose, and without spiritual depth. And it is, I believe, one of the deeper spiritual problems we face today. Welcome to We Have a Spiritual Problem, a podcast where we confront the deeper questions beneath our personal struggles and collective crises. I am your host, Dr. Jeff Armstrong. I am not a theologian or a philosopher, or at least by training. I am a PhD exercise physiologist with an interest in the intersection of the physical and the spiritual. In this episode, we're exploring what true servant leadership looks like and why its absence is felt so profoundly in the cultural and political life of the United States. We'll consider Ken Blanchard's classic book, Servant Leadership, Jesus' example leading through service, and reflect on the idea of catching people doing things right, on Teilhard de Chardin's vision of spiritual evolution, and on how the SPIES model of wellness helps us understand the kind of leadership our world most needs. And we'll revisit a conversation I had with Greg Stewart on Christian Nationalism and how What Would Jesus Do became Make America Great Again, a shift that reveals more about our spiritual state than our politics alone. Everywhere we look, leadership is under scrutiny. Corporate scandals, political gridlock, religious institutions entangled in culture wars, celebrity pastors falling from grace, CEOs and politicians building personal brands while public trust crumbles. Even in smaller communities, church boards, schools, local organizations, we can feel it. This is not simply a leadership crisis. It is a crisis of spiritual formation. Leadership has become a performance, a stage, a microphone, a brand. And behind it, too often, is a simple question: how does this serve me? That's what I mean by self-servant leadership. It's leadership wrapped in the language of service, but oriented toward the ego. Contrast that with servant leadership, which begins not with the self, but with others, with listening, humility, shared mission, and a willingness to lay down power for the good of the community. Ken Blanchard helped to bring this concept into the mainstream of leadership thought. Many know him as the co-author of The 1 Minute Manager, but his legacy is the work he did around servant leadership. As Martha C. Stewart described so powerfully in episode 44, Blanchard's life and leadership were grounded in a simple but profound belief: the best leaders are servants first. He believed in catching people doing things right, not waiting to criticize, but choosing to affirm and build people up. This wasn't naive positivity. It was a deeply spiritual conviction that leadership is about unleashing the potential of others. In his framework, the leader's job was not to be the hero, but to create heroes. Leadership is not about being on top of the pyramid, it's about flipping the pyramid upside down. This philosophy stands in stark contrast to the strongman leadership that dominates in much of our political imagination today. The idea that the leader must be the loudest, the toughest, the one who never apologizes, never admits fault, never bows, never serves. This isn't just modern leadership theory. It's deeply rooted in the life and teachings of Jesus. The night before his crucifixion, Jesus washed the feet of his disciples. That moment was not just a sentimental gesture. It was a radical inversion of power. In the Roman world, foot washing was the work of servants, the lowest of the low. Jesus, their teacher and Lord, kneels before them and says, "I have set you an example that you should do as I have done to you." This is servant leadership. Leadership not as domination, but as radical, embodied service. Jesus' entire ministry embodied this pattern. He lifted up the marginalized. He ate with those who had no status. He refused to use power to coerce. He led by invitation, not by intimidation. If we take seriously the idea of spiritual evolution, of humanity growing toward what Teilhard de Chardin called the omega point, a fullness of love and consciousness, then servant leadership isn't just a moral choice, it's an evolutionary pathway. Leadership, rooted in ego, drags us backward. Leadership rooted in service moves us forward. In a conversation I had with Greg Stewart, we reflected on a striking cultural shift. In the 1990s, many Christians wore WWJD bracelets. What would Jesus do? It wasn't perfect, but it at least pointed people back toward the example of Jesus' life and posture. Somewhere along the way, that question was co-opted, not by those who wanted to embody Jesus' servant leadership, but by those who wanted to weaponize faith as a political identity. The language shifted from what would Jesus do to make America great again? And along with that shift came a change in the kind of leadership that was celebrated. Where Jesus modeled humility, we now celebrate defiance. Where Jesus washed feet, we now elevate those who trample over others to claim power. Where Jesus said, "The greatest among you must be your servant," we now hear, "The greatest among you must be the loudest, the angriest, and the most dominant." This is not a political issue alone. It's a spiritual formation issue. The kind of leader we celebrate reveals the kind of people we are becoming. One of the reasons I return again and again to the SPIES model, spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional, and social wellness, is because leadership touches every one of these domains. Spiritual wellness means leading from a center that is not your ego. It's about knowing who you are and whose you are, so that leadership becomes an act of service, not self-justification. Physical wellness matters too, because servant leadership isn't abstract, it's embodied. Leaders who are exhausted, burned out, or physiologically dysregulated will struggle to lead with presence and humility. This isn't about fitness, it's about stewardship of the body that carries the leadership work. Intellectual wellness is about curiosity over certainty. The best servant leaders are learners. They ask questions. They create space for others to contribute. They resist the impulse to always have the last word. Emotional wellness is essential because self-servant leadership often comes from unhealed wounds. The ego steps in to protect, to control, to be seen. Servant leadership requires emotional maturity, a willingness to regulate one's inner world so that others don't have to walk on eggshells. Social wellness is about how leadership builds community. Servant leadership is generative. It creates trust, connection, shared mission. Self-servant leadership creates division, hierarchy, fear, and competition. One of the most powerful ideas Ken Blanchard championed was deceptively simple: catch people doing things right. In self-serving leadership cultures, leaders are constantly on the lookout for mistakes. They lead through criticism, fear, and punishment. It creates a culture where everyone plays not to lose. In servant leadership cultures, leaders look for the good. They acknowledge, encourage, and empower. That doesn't mean ignoring problems. It means leading with hope rather than fear. When you catch people doing things right, you build trust, agency, collective strength. I think about this often in our national discourse. What would change if instead of constantly tearing one another down, we became a people committed to catching each other doing things right? What if leadership at every level modeled that posture? What if churches, schools, businesses, and political institutions became places where leaders existed to serve the flourishing of others? What we are witnessing in the United States is not just an absence of servant leadership. It's the institutionalization of self-servant leadership. Leaders seeking platforms, not purpose. Leaders who feed division because division strengthens their brand. Leaders who want followers, not partners. This mirrors what happens when the ego rules the spiritual life. When faith becomes about me, my tribe, my identity, my certainty, it ceases to be a pathway of transformation and becomes a tool of self-protection. Christian nationalism is perhaps the clearest contemporary example. It dresses itself in spiritual language, but is fundamentally about protecting and elevating self-interest. It's not servant leadership. It's ego leadership baptized in religious rhetoric. Teilhard de Chardin might say that this kind of leadership resists evolution. It locks us into tribal consciousness rather than moving us towards the omega point, a vision of humanity united in love, not divided by fear. Servant leadership is not a soft skill, it's a spiritual practice. And like all spiritual practices, it's countercultural. It asks us to lead not from ego, but from love, not from fear, but from trust, not from dominance, but from service. When we practice servant leadership, we are participating in what Teilhard called the slow work of evolution, not biological, but spiritual evolution. Every act of servant leadership moves the needle toward this greater consciousness. Every self-serving leader moves it backwards. And this is why the absence of servant leadership in the United States isn't just frustrating, it's dangerous. It threatens the spiritual fabric of communities. But the reverse is also true. When servant leadership rises, even in small spaces, it creates ripples of change that extend far beyond the leader. We can't wait for Washington to model servant leadership. We can't wait for megachurch pastors or corporate executives to lead the way. This must start where it has always started, in homes, small communities, local institutions, and personal choices. Servant leadership isn't a position, it's a posture. It's the teacher who listens before lecturing, the manager who serves their team, the pastor who leads without pedestal, the neighbor who chooses compassion over judgment, the citizen who engages with courage, not contempt. Servant leadership isn't about being soft, it's about being strong enough to kneel. I think often about the contrast between Jesus washing feet and our modern images of leadership. Somewhere along the way, we traded towels for megaphones. But the world doesn't need more powerful personalities. It needs more towel bearers. This is not a call to nostalgia. It's a call to spiritual evolution, a call to return to what leadership was meant to be, an act of love. If we want to address the spiritual problems at the root of our culture, the polarization, the fear, the cynicism, then we must cultivate a new generation of servant leaders. Leaders who catch people doing things right. Leaders who serve instead of posture. Leaders who lead toward the omega point, not away from it. Thank you for joining me in this episode of We Have a Spiritual Problem. If today's conversation resonated with you, I encourage you to reflect on where you lead, in your home, in your workplace, your community. What would it look like for you to lead as a servant, not as a self? I am Dr. Jeff Armstrong. Until next time, may you lead and live with courage, humility, and love as we continue the slow, beautiful work of spiritual evolution together.